Today I'm going to talk to you a little bit about informal reading inventories. This is basically an informational video for those wanting to know a little bit more about how to conduct or analyze an informal reading inventory, what we call an IRI. There's two parts to it. We're going to focus on part 2 today. So that's kind of our goal. And before I start, just in case you haven't seen the first video, or aren't familiar with all of the parts of an IRI, I want to kind of do an overview of what constitutes an informal reading inventory. So an informal reading inventory, or what we call an IRI for short, is basically an informal assessment, and there are many different commercial IRIs out there on the market. Flint Cooter, Bader, those come to mind. My actual very favorite is called the Basic Reading Inventory by Johns, Piper & Johns. I don't make any money on this. I'm just telling you I love this one. This is the one I use. So it looks like this. This is the 12th edition. So the examples that I'm going to be going through today as we learn how to do this are going to come from the Basic Reading Inventory by Johns, Piper & Johns. And some of the things I really like about it are they make it very easy to analyze the data and to make the determinations of reading levels and that kind of thing. They give you a lot of information, and the stories seem pretty good and that kind of thing. So those are a few of the reasons that I like that particular one. If you've watched my first video on the first part of the IRI, I talk a lot more about the details of what I like on the first part of that. But just basically, any informal reading inventory, or IRI, has some kind of common characteristics. So just about all IRIs that I'm familiar with have two parts to them. They'll have, in the first parts, usually a graded word list. Sometimes they'll do graded phrases instead of words. So basically, they'll start as low as kindergarten level, and they'll have word lists, and they'll work all the way up to 12th grade level. That's what they mean by graded. And when we do the graded word list, we're having the child read words in isolation and scoring them. The second part of an IRI is what we call graded passages. And these are stories that are as young as kindergarten level, and they, again, will be all the way up through 12th grade level. So you can use this type of assessment on any child, basically grade K through 12. And some of the main things that we do with the informal reading inventory are we identify the child's independent, instructional, and frustration reading levels so that we can choose materials that are appropriate for instruction for our different purposes. And the part 1, the graded word list, is for recognizing words in isolation. It's just a list of words. And then when we go to part 2, we'll actually have them read a passage and answer. We'll have them do a retell and then answer comprehension questions. So again, it gives us a fuller measure of what the child can do, both words in isolation, words in the context of a story, and then their ability to comprehend what they read. So all of that goes into the scoring of an IRI. Whenever you're conducting an IRI, it's really important that you use the correct materials. When I am talking about that, there's always a student version that the child is supposed to see when they're reading, or whether it's words or stories or whatever. And then there's the actual score sheets that the person doing the assessment will use. And they look very different. And it's really important that the child only use the child's version. It looks very different. You can see a few examples here. Those lower level stories are set up to accommodate their level of reading expertise and developmental abilities. So, and they get a little bit more advanced as they get to higher levels. The font size will be bigger for the younger children's stories. You'll notice as the grade level goes up, the text gets smaller and there's more words on the page. So it's really important that the child be seeing a copy of the text that's at their appropriate developmental stage. So we wouldn't want the child looking at an adult score sheet and vice versa. So that's one of the things that you need to make sure that you have is all of the materials that you would need for the scoring. I'm going to take just a minute to show you what those forms look like. First of all, I'll show you an example of the graded word list. You can see this is a kindergarten level of list, and they work their way up, first grade, second grade. You can see how much larger the font is with the lower levels, and there's actually less words on the kindergarten list. Once you get to first grade and up, there's usually 20 words on the list, and you can see that font size getting smaller. So even with the graded word list, it's very important to actually use the correct forms. You'll also notice this is what the score sheet would look like that you would use when administering the graded word list assessment, which is part one of the IRI. And you can see that you wouldn't want your child looking at that. There's lots of things to distract them on the page, but it also has all kinds of things about how to score them and that kind of thing. So that's what that looks like when we look at the IRI part one, which is the graded word list. Now let me take you to see the part two, which is the graded passages. And so you can tell a real difference between the first picture, which is the story that the child would look at, and then the score sheet that you would actually fill out as the child's reading. And you'll notice that there are many pieces to it. There's columns here to analyze the different kinds of errors that they make, and then there's a whole other page that analyzes their retell and their comprehension questions. So that's what the forms look like that we would use when conducting part two, which is the graded passages. This is an actual example of a third grade passage, and we're going to watch a video in just a minute of a child being assessed with this story. And so you can kind of see that process in action. And we'll take you through that, and then I'll actually show you the scoring that I did on that child and kind of talk you through that process of how we make those instructional decisions based on that data. So there are several things that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to identify a child's independent and instructional reading levels. One of the reasons that we do need to know that information is because it helps us to choose appropriate materials for the different purposes that we'll have the child read for. For example, if I'm having them read a library book on their own, maybe during dear time or whatever you call it, I would want the child to be able to read something that's in their independent reading zone, even if it's on the high end, because they're not going to have any support for that. And especially if you're going to ask them to complete some kind of assessment afterwards. For example, a lot of kids in schools have to take AR test or something like that. It really, if they're going to read it on their own and be responsible for being assessed on comprehension, it needs to be at their independent reading level. However, if you're teaching reading strategies to children, and in weekly you should be meeting with them in some type of guided reading groups, and if you're doing that, when you're teaching them new reading strategies, you want to have them practice those strategies, and that needs to be done on instructional level text. In other words, it's a little more challenging. It's not too overwhelming. It's not too challenging where they can't be successful and can't understand, but it's not too easy where they can actually have some words they don't know so that they can practice the reading strategies on. And so that's one of the main reasons that we want to know what level of text would be at a child's independent reading level, and what level of text might be the child's instructional reading level. It's not as simple as saying, well, they're a second grader, so they should be able to read second grade level text. It doesn't work that way. In a classroom of 20, 25, 30 kids, you're not going to have everyone on those same reading levels. Everyone kind of progresses and develops at their own pace. So you might have some children in second grade that are reading at kindergarten and first grade level, and you might have some reading at fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth grade, ninth grade level. You just don't know. And then you'll have some that are just kind of right in there in second, third grade level. So we want to make sure to challenge our kids, but not with things that are going to overwhelm them. And that's how we differentiate the instruction, is by making sure the materials that we provide them are appropriate. So that's one of the things that we do. When we're trying to identify a child's independent and instructional reading levels, it's not just as simple as just read the story and I'll calculate how many words you get right and how fast you read it, and that's all there is to it. There's more to it than that. We have to think about not only accuracy, but automaticity. We have to think about the rate, but also, are they able to read it fluently? Are they able to parse the phrases correctly? Are they able to read with the punctuation and the author's meaning? Do they understand it? Is there comprehension? At the end of the day, that's the most important thing. So even if they can physically read it, if there's not comprehension, then it's not at their independent reading level. We also look at a lot of other behaviors. Sometimes students will repeat a lot, or they'll make lots of errors, but then they self-correct them. And that means they're monitoring their reading, and so we want them to be self-correcting. However, if they're doing that too much, it can really interfere with comprehension, because they're focusing so much on accuracy that they aren't really able to have the brain power focused on the comprehension of the story. So we really want to look at some of the other behaviors we might notice. You might see things like facial expressions or body language that tells you they're frustrated or stressed out. You might see a lot of finger pointing and really trying to track the text. You might see them get really quiet when they read, and start kind of mumbling because they're a little bit frustrated. Maybe they're trying to cover up for the fact that they don't know some of the words. Just different behaviors like that. So we have to take all of that into consideration. It's not as easy as just saying, well, they got all the words right, or they got almost all the words right, so it must be independent level text. We have to look at more things than that. So one of the things that we do after we've done the graded word list assessment, which we would have done in part 1, that would help us to choose an appropriate passage to do the second part of the IRI, which is the graded passages. And so what we would do is we would take a passage that is at the child's highest independent or lowest instructional reading level based on the graded word list. So that's a help for us to do that part first, and it helps us to choose an appropriate text. And so that's one of the first things that we do when we're getting ready to do the graded passage assessment. So before we look at the story and watch the video, I want to go over some of the markings that are used when you're doing an informal reading inventories. There's specific markings for the different types of what we call miscues, which is another name for errors. We call it miscue. When a child comes to a word they don't know, sometimes they'll make an attempt at the word, and so sometimes the attempt they make is inaccurate. And so what we do is we write the word that they say just above the word, and we call that a substitution. So in the example here, it says Jim saw the boy, but the child said Jim saw a boy, so they just wrote the word a above the to show that they substituted that word. Now, in the scheme of things, that's really not that big of a deal as far as comprehension-wise. It's not going to keep them from understanding what's happening. So we would call that kind of an insignificant miscue. But depending on what type of assessment you're doing at a school, when they're DIBELS testing or benchmark testing, they're going to count that wrong. And if they make too many of those careless kinds of errors, that could really affect their score and might indicate on the benchmark test that they're not um, reading at the proficiency level that they should be, when really it might not be as serious a situation as what it sounds like from looking at their scores. So that's why I prefer these informal assessments that gives more information. We can see that even though they did make a miscue, sometimes good readers will do that. They'll make kind of careless errors, if you want to call them that, because they're thinking more about the bigger meaning of the text, and they're kind of reading ahead and reading phrasing. And so they might do what we call an omission, which is the next example there, and they might skip a word altogether because it doesn't seem important to them, and so they might not read that word out loud, especially things like said dad or mother said, things like that. They might read them in their mind, but they might not say them out loud because they're moving on in the story. But unfortunately, if you're doing a benchmark test, those things would count against a child. So you have to really think about that. So you can see on the omissions, some IRIs will have you draw a line through it. I really prefer to circle it. I think that shows up a little better whenever you're going back and looking at your data. So if they omit, we put an O around it and circle it to show that they left it out. Sometimes readers, when they don't know a word, they'll do that. They'll just skip over the word and not even try it. So that's called an omission, and that is a scoreable error also. Sometimes when kids are reading, they insert words, they add extra words. Could be for a lot of reasons. Sometimes it's because it sounds like it ought to be there to them, making it more interesting or whatever. Sometimes it's because that's what they think's coming next, because they're kind of into the story and thinking about what would sound right to them, and they may leave it, they may come back and self-correct. If it doesn't really affect the meaning, it doesn't change anything, they probably won't self-correct it because it doesn't bother them. But that's called an insertion, and you can see we put the little caret between the two words where they added the extra word, and then we just write the word in there. Then there's something called reversals, and this is when they might reverse the order of two words that they read, and this might just be because in their oral language it sounds more natural the other way. So they're reading along and it says said dad, and they might read dad said. It doesn't change the meaning. It's not a significant miscue, but it is a miscue. And if you were doing a running record, or if you were doing a benchmark test like a DIBELS test or BEAR or whatever, that would count as scoreable errors because they missed the words. So you have to be careful about those kinds of things. So those are the main types of scoreable errors. Sometimes on a substitution, we also have another category of substitution called a mispronunciation. It's still a substitution, but that might be if a child says a word that's not even a word. It's like a nonsense word or whatever. And so you could go in there and just write kind of phonetically above what it sounded like they said. Or sometimes it's just saying the word inaccurately. It might be like saying spaghetti instead of spaghetti, or it might be something like they see the word and it's supposed to be record, but they say record, but that's the wrong usage for that particular sentence, and so it counts as a mispronunciation, which is still a substitution. So those are the types of scoreable errors that you'll see. We also have some behaviors that we want to notice, and one of those is repetition. And sometimes this is just a strategy that we use and we teach kids to use, so it's not a bad thing if they repeat. Sometimes when they're reading and they come to a word they don't know, we teach them to kind of think about what it might be, maybe go back and start over with the sentence and try it again, that kind of thing. So they might repeat. Sometimes it's more of a nervous habit. They just repeat a lot. They're kind of fumbling through the story. It might be a little too difficult for them, and so they might do a lot more repetition than they really need to. Um, and sometimes you'll see students self-correct. So these two things are pretty important. When they repeat, we box around the words that they actually repeat, and we just put an R there for repeat. And if they were to do it more than one time, we would put a number out there to show how many times they repeated it. So in this sentence where it says Jim saw a bear, we can tell that he read that part twice because we boxed around it and put the R. Again, sometimes an IRI will just say to underline it and put an R, but it's really hard to see what's been repeated. It's harder to find it when it's just underlined, and so the box really makes it stand out more when you're analyzing later, and that's helpful. On the self-correct, if they've made some kind of an omission or substitution or whatever, and then they fix it, then you can just write SC next to it to show they self-corrected. And then when we're counting the scorable errors, we'll subtract that one back off because they fixed it. But it still tells us what type of errors they were making before they corrected it. So those are the main markings. You see some other ones here. Honestly, these IRIs, sometimes they get a little carried away with all the different markings and they kind of get things in there that aren't necessary. And that's what I would say some of these are. Now, if they have, if there's something where you do a teacher assist, like you give them the word, like you wait 5 seconds or so, they're not even trying anymore. They're just kind of staring and waiting for you to tell them they can go on. You can give them the word, or you can just tell them it's okay to skip it and go on. But if you do give them the word, that's the same thing as an omission. You'd circle the word, but you can also write that you told them the word. That way, if later on they get the word correct, you'll know that it's because you gave them the word. You can also use a P for a long pause if you want. It's also important to note that if they skip punctuation, they don't read the punctuation that's there, they don't stop when it says period, there's a period or something. It's important to mark those things, and those are scorable errors. They're considered omissions also. So those are the main things that we score um, as far as the types of errors that a child can make. I'm going to get out of this form, and we're getting ready to actually watch the video. This is not a video that I made. This is one that came with our textbook, and you can see them performing this assessment. Some of the things that you need to know when you're doing an assessment, a graded passage assessment, is it's important to tell them ahead of time that you're going to ask them to read a story, and when they're finished, you're going to ask them to tell you about it and kind of let them know that ahead of time. Otherwise, the child might be thinking that you just want to hear how fast they can read, and they won't really think about the story or the meaning. And then all of a sudden you start asking comprehension questions and they're going, oh, I wasn't even thinking about that. I just wanted to read really fast for you. So we want to make sure that they understand that they're going to need to think about meaning, not just read fast. And so when you first give them the story to read, with the younger children, like kindergarten through first grade, you'll read the title for them. But on older ones, you'll just point and say, we're going to start here, and have them read the title. And in this video, they actually have them do what they call activating prior knowledge by having them make some predictions based on the title, what they think the story is going to be about. And it actually has a place there on the form for you as the scorer to determine if you feel like they have adequate prior knowledge or adequate background to the story, and if what they say is kind of reasonable. And that's really just a judgment call on you. It's really not necessary to do that, but that is one extra piece that they have in their IRI. Once they read the story, you'll remove the story away from them, and then you'll ask for a retell. We're going to watch that also. So you'll ask them to, tell you what the story's about. Some kids don't talk that much, and they're going to give you just what they can get by with and no more. They don't want to have to tell a bunch, and so you can probe just a little bit. Say, is there anything else you remember? Okay, any more that you want to say? What else do you remember? maybe a couple of times like that. And if you're not getting any more, then there are actual questions that are on the form that you can ask them specifically. Now, if in the retail they already covered some of those questions and already answered them, you can kind of check those off. You don't have to ask them again, because then they think, well, I just told you, why are you asking me that again? So it's kind of redundant. So if they cover some of those questions in their retail, you can kind of check them off. They do have a nice thing on this form, a box where you can pretty much write down what they tell you on the retail, just kind of shorthand, and so there's a nice rubric that helps you to give them a comprehension score based on their retail, and then another comprehension score that you can give based on the questions that they were able to answer. And so those are two nice comprehension measures that you can put alongside of the accuracy and rate and everything else that we'll look at. So that's basically the process. And we'll talk more when we look at the scoring of the questions about some things that you can do there. Okay, so we're going to start showing the video.
Elise, now I'm going to have you read some passages and answer some questions. The first thing I'd like you to do on passage A3183 is to read the title silently, and then I want you to tell me what you predict the passage might be about with that title.
Well, I kind of predict that it's about a bear, and he's like, and he's hungry, and so he's probably like gonna be like looking for like honey to eat. So he would just like walk around, and if he saw a hive, he would like look in there and see if it was full or something. But he has like a problem, like there's none that has any honey in there. But then he keeps on wandering around and he finds another one. He finds one that's full.
Okay, thank you. Now I'm going to ask you to go ahead and read the passage.
The busy bees had been making honey all day. That night it was cool and damp. I had slept well until I heard a loud noise in my window, near my window. It sounded like as if someone were trying to break into my cabin. As I moved from my cot, I could see something black standing near the window. In fright, I knocked on the window very slowly and quietly. The great shadow moved back and went away. The next day, we found a huge bear tracks. The bear had come for honey the bees were making in the attic of the cabin.
Okay, so you can see how she read, and maybe you took the form and you tried to score along with her. We're going to look at the scoring in just a minute. First, we're going to listen to her comprehension questions and her retail. So we'll do that next. But you noticed probably some things about her reading of that story. It wasn't real smooth. There was a lot of repetition, a lot of self-correcting, and that kind of thing. So we're going to talk about that. Let's go back and hear the comprehension.
Now I'm going to ask you some questions. Elise, can you tell me what's this story about?
It's kind of about where the bees, they're sleeping, and they hear like a loud noise and stuff, and one of the bees they see the bear, and once they woke up, it was bear tracks outside the hive, and so after that they kind of actually went back to work.
Okay. Can you tell me what had the bees been doing?
They've been working all day trying to make honey.
Okay. Where were the bees making honey?
In the hive.
Okay.
Well, in the cabin.
Okay. Who or what woke the person up in the story?
I think it was it was like a sound or something.
What was near the window?
The bee said like it was a shadow, but it was really a bear.
Okay. What was found the next day?
Bear tracks.
What did the bear want?
The honey.
Why do you think the bear walked away?
Probably because he saw the bear saw the it saw that the bee had woken up and was tapping on the window, so that's why he just walked away.
Okay. What might you do to keep the bear away?
Probably just like kind of ignore it, or probably just ignore it.
Okay. What is an attic?
An attic is it's like a high room, and it's a room and it's like a room kind of at the near the top of the house. And I think it's a small room with like one window.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
Okay, so now we've gotten to hear her retell and listen to the answering of the comprehension questions. So now, and it's not pretty, but I'll show you just my chicken scratch scoring of this assessment so you can kind of compare it with your own notes, and we're going to kind of talk through what this data actually tells us about this reader. First of all, I thought I would just put the story back up on the screen for a minute so you have a chance to read through it. So now let's move down to my scoring. It seemed like to me, and you probably noticed the same thing, that it sounded like there were lots and lots of errors, right? Lots of scoreable errors. But when you start looking at it, there's actually a lot of self-correction that's going on also. So it's a little messy looking. One thing I want to remind you is the scoreable errors are in this first area, this boxed in area here. So substitutions, insertions, omissions, and reversals, those all count as one scoreable error or miscue. The things on this side, these three categories, they're behaviors that we want to make note of, but they're not scoreable errors. One of those is repetition, and one of those is self-correction. And then there's actually a column here at the end where you can count on each row any errors that they don't self-correct. You can make a note whether it would be considered a significant miscue or not. And basically, if it changes the meaning, if it would disrupt meaning or keep them from comprehending by reading it the way they did and they don't self-correct, we would consider that a meaningful, significant miscue and a meaning changing, and so we would give them the mark there. So first of all, let's just go through and look at the scoring. On the first row, very first thing she did was repeat a couple of times. Again, that's not scoreable errors, but it's a behavior we notice. If it was occasional, we're okay with that. But if it's a thing that's happening a lot, it becomes distracting and it can impede their comprehension. So first row, 2 repetitions. The second row, there's no miscues. Then the third row, I did make note here, anytime they make an attempt on a word, you want to make note of that. And the fact that she kind of did and then paused and then did slept, I went ahead and gave her credit with a check mark there. But I just wanted to make note that she hesitated on that. I wasn't really sure why. And then she substituted, she said in instead of near, but then she self-corrected. But when she did that, she actually said in my window, and then she made that little and then she went back and corrected it by repeating and said near my window. So that counted as a repetition. I put the repetition here, even though it carried over the second line. I just counted it once up here, and then we counted a substitution with a self-correction. On the next row, another repetition right after that on the word it. So we mark that here. And then she says it sounded like instead of as. And probably that's just because in her normal speech, that's what flows out, and it made sense to her. And honestly, that would not really be considered significant, would it? To say it sounded like, it sounded as if. She's probably not used to hearing it sounded as if. It's a little more formal speech, and she's young, and so probably doesn't use that much formal type of speech. So she did self-correct. And so we make note that she substituted and then self-corrected over here. On the next row, again, another repetition twice. She repeated on break, and she repeated, and she actually substituted. She started to say as soon. That's what kind of jumped to her mind. She's kind of reading and thinking about what the story is, I guess, and says as soon, and then realized that wasn't it. She self-corrected, so as, and then said as I. So she both repeated and self-corrected and substitution all in the same thing. You can see how these can kind of get messy sometimes trying to score all this stuff. And if you're like me, you might have to go back and listen to the audio recording or something multiple times to make sure you get everything. So that's definitely something you might have to do, especially till you get really good at them. When you get to where you do them all the time, you can do it a little faster, and it's not so much of a struggle. The next row, no miscues. Then the next row, another repetition twice, and 2 repetitions. Again, not scoreable errors, but she did do that behavior 2 times in one row. And then on this next row, she actually reads right over top of that period. She omits that and does not stop there. And it totally changes the meaning of the sentences, because she says, in fright, I knocked on the window very slowly and quietly. And it's supposed to be very slowly and quietly that great shadow moved away. So she's changed the meaning of the story. So over here, she has an omission for omitting the period and then the repetition, but also we're going to give her a point there for the meaning changing error, because changing the punctuation the way she did does change the meaning of the story. And so we go to the next row, no errors. The next row, we see that she inserted a word. She said the next day we found a huge bear tracks. She actually put that in there and then realized it and repeated found and corrected. So instead of founding a huge, she went back and said found huge. So she self-corrected as she repeated. So that was an insertion and a repetition, but then also a self-correction. And even though she did that, she said we found a huge bear tracks, whatever. At the point that she was reading to, that really doesn't affect meaning, saying a huge bear instead of huge bear tracks. So we wouldn't count that as affecting meaning. And on the next to the last line, she actually omits the word the. The bear had come for the honey the bees were making, so she omitted that. And she also said from. She said from instead of for a couple of times, and then realized it wasn't right. And as she repeated, she self-corrected that. And so you have a substitution that gets corrected. You also have an omission that did not get corrected, and you have a repetition. Now, the omission of the word the did not change, excuse me, the meaning of the story. So we're not going to hold that against her. We're not going to consider that a scoreable meaning changing type error, but we're just going to make note of it. Now, one of the things you'll notice I did is right after the word the, I put a little hash mark and wrote 1 minute. If you're timing your child, and not in an obnoxious way where they're noticing it, because that can really distract them, and it can also make them think it's a hurry. They have to hurry and rush, and that you just want to hear how fast they can read, and that'll totally change your data. But if you can very nonchalantly record the timing, when you get to the 1 minute mark, if you'll make your little line there, it makes it real easy to calculate the words correct per minute. Okay, and so that's why I did that. You can see that at the end of this row is 92, That means when we get to the word bees, that's 92 words in this story, but she only got to, we have to take off these 3, so that make it 89. So if you'll notice, I made a note right down here, 89 words per minute, but I also had to subtract off any miscues that were not corrected. And there were 2 up at that point that had not been self-corrected, and so I took those off, and that gave her a words correct per minute, or WCPM, words correct per minute, of 87 words. Okay, and so that's one of the measures I can look at. I can actually take that and look at a norm percentile group, and I can see kind of where she falls percentile ranking wise with others of her peers. And so that's one of the things that we can calculate. You'll notice that after we're all finished, I let her go ahead and finish the story. That's important. And she did finish the story. It took her 1 minute and 9 seconds to read the entire passage. And so I can take the 100 total words that she attempted during that time, and I can take off any uncorrected miscues, and actually her accuracy rate is 98%. So if I were only looking at accuracy, I would say, wow, this must be at her independent reading level because she read it pretty accurate, right? But I don't know if you're like me, but I don't think this is at her independent reading level. I think there's other things that we have to look at, just as far as not even thinking about comprehension yet. We'll talk about that next. But just looking at the fluency with which she was able to read, very kind of disjointed, a lot of tripping over words and repeating very excessively. You can see that she had 11 repetitions in this story in like barely over a minute. 11 repetitions is a lot. And she also had 1 error that, or miscue, that was meaning changing, and she had 5 self-corrections. So she's got a lot of tripping over things and then fixing it, tripping and then fixing it and going back. And so when we look at some of the other behaviors besides just accuracy and besides rate, we have to consider that her fluency was pretty poor, and the phrasing, the prosody, reading the punctuation wasn't there. She even had a couple of times when she audibly expressed frustration. She was like, ugh, and things like that. So those are things I make note of, because that's telling me she's a little bit frustrated, and that this isn't necessarily just because she only has 2 non-self-corrected errors, and appears, if you look at the chart, it looks like this might be at her independent / instructional reading level. If you look at total miscues, she only has 2 total miscues that weren't self-corrected, and that puts her in the range 2 to 4 is independent / instructional. If you go on significant miscues, she only had 1, and that would put it at independent level text. But we can't go just on that. We have to look at these other behaviors too. And then we have to look at the comprehension. So just looking at the table, it would tell us it's somewhere between independent and instructional level. We're not quite sure yet. We need some more information. I did look at the percentile ranking, and if this were done in the middle of the school year, they've got different tables for beginning, middle, and end of the school year. And if this had been done at the middle of 3rd grade school year, this would put her in about the 50th percentile. So not horrible, but not great. They really didn't indicate what time of year it was when they did this assessment on this child, so we don't have any way to know. So I just took the middle. So let's look now at the comprehension piece. Let me show you a little bit about this form. First of all, there's the box to write down what they say in the retell, and you can see that I've done that in this first part here. I just kind of wrote basically what she said, which was that it's kind of about where the bees sleeping and they hear loud noise, and one of the bees wakes up and sees the bear, and it sees the bear's tracks, and then it gets back to work. It goes back to work. That's basically what she said. And when I was listening to her retell, it was very evident to me that she didn't know what was going on in the story. Um, it was really clear that she didn't realize there was a person in the story. She thinks the bees went to the window and tapped on the window. Um, and So those are some of the things that, as we listened to her comprehension questions, that, and you could tell the lady answered or asked most of the comprehension questions because she could tell she didn't really understand what was going on, because the bees weren't the ones that woke up and went to the window. It was whoever was in the cabin, right? And this girl didn't get that. Um, so when you look at the answers, one of the things that's nice about these comprehension questions is they'll have a code out to the side that tells you what type of question it is. And if it has a T next to it, that means it's a topic, like what's the topic of the story or whatever. If it has an F, that's a factual type question. If it has an I and it's an inferential type question. If it has an E, it's an evaluative type question. So something inferential and evaluative are more higher order thinking, they're more abstract. And then V is a vocabulary question. So every comprehension piece will have a variety of questions like that. You can look for patterns. Are there certain types of questions that they're able to answer and others they're not? And I noticed here that on the factual type of things, she really pretty much could answer them. So she did have some comprehension, but when it got down to why do you think the bear walked away? And she says he saw the bees, woke up and tapped on the window. So she's not understanding who tapped on the window. I mean, she's still thinking someone else that the bees are telling the story. She doesn't understand who's telling the story. So she doesn't get that. And then when it says, what might you do to keep the bear away? And she said, ignore it. It's that you have to, as a teacher, you have some power here, because you have to consider what's a reasonable response. Their suggested one was like to remove the honey, get the hive out of there. You know, if the hive wasn't there and the honey wasn't there, the bear wouldn't be attracted to the house. She doesn't get that. She isn't understanding that concept of the story. And so I didn't give credit for that. If you're ever not sure about their answer and you're not sure what they're trying to say, you can probe for more information. Say, tell me more about that. Can you explain that to me a little bit? You know, you can probe for more information if you're not sure. And then you can make a decision whether to give them credit. So one thing that I noticed is on the kind of the factual stuff about, you know, that they were making honey and what an attic was and what woke them up. Yeah, a sound, you know, things like that. But whenever it was higher order thinking types of questions, she really struggled with that. The retell, I felt like was real clear. So to me, it sounded like she missed the real gist of the story of what was happening. And if you look at the retell rubric, it gives you some things to kind of go by on that. And then there's also, based on how many questions they get right, this will put her at 80% comprehension. But you can look on here and it's independent/instructional if they miss up to 2. If she missed one more, it would move up a level. So when you take the comprehension measure and the accuracy rate and you look at the behaviors of the reading with all the fluency and those kinds of things, it's clear that it's not at her independent reading level. So it could possibly be at her instructional reading level. This would challenge her, and she would need some support to be successful on it. But you definitely wouldn't want her trying to read this all on her own, this level of text. It's obviously a little bit too difficult at this point. And so that's kind of what I put on here. And these are the kinds of things that you would do as you analyze this type of text. So if you do have questions that you need specific answers to, you're welcome to reach out to me or to your own professor, whoever you're working with, and ask them for more information. So I hope that this has been helpful for you, and I look forward to seeing you again in another training video.